You see, there's something that has fascinated me for most of my life. Something that sits at the very heart of what it means to be human. In July of 1969, while the world held its breath, two members of our species climbed down a ladder and pressed their boots into the dust of another world. They walked on the moon. They actually walked on the moon. Now, I was there, not on the moon, of course, but I was part of that extraordinary moment in human history. I watched it unfold. I knew some of the people who made it happen, and I can tell you that even then, even as we celebrated, there was a whisper in the back of every scientist's mind. A quiet, persistent question that we rarely spoke aloud. How did we actually pull this off? Because when you sit down and look at the physics, when you calculate the energies involved, when you examine the technology available in 1969, when you consider the thousands of things that could have gone wrong, you start to realize something extraordinary. The moon landing wasn't just difficult. By any reasonable measure, it should have been impossible. Now, before you think I've become one of those people who believe it was filmed in a Hollywood studio, let me be absolutely clear. We went to the moon. The evidence is overwhelming and irrefutable. But that's precisely what makes this story so remarkable. We did something that perhaps we had no business doing. We reached beyond our grasp, and somehow, against all odds, we didn't fall. That is the real mystery. Not whether we went, but how we went. How did a species that had only learned to fly 66 years earlier manage to send 3 men across 250,000 miles of empty space and bring them home safely? How did we navigate with computers less powerful than a modern calculator? How did we protect human beings from the lethal radiation of space with spacecraft made primarily of aluminum foil and hope? These questions deserve answers. Not to cast doubt, but to illuminate the extraordinary nature of what we accomplished, because the truth is far more inspiring than any conspiracy. The truth is that we did something that should have been impossible, and we did it anyway. Let me take you on a journey through the physics of impossibility, through the engineering miracles, through the human courage that made this all possible. Let's begin with the most fundamental challenge: distance. The moon is far away. I know that sounds obvious, but I don't think most people truly appreciate what this means. When you look up at the moon on a clear night, it appears close enough to touch. It hangs there in the sky, luminous and familiar, a companion that has watched over our species since we first looked upward and wondered. But that familiarity is an illusion. The moon is approximately 384,000 kilometers from Earth. That's 238,000 miles. To put this in perspective, if you could drive a car to the moon at highway speeds, it would take you about 6 months of continuous driving. No stops, no sleep, just driving toward that pale light in the sky for half a year. The Apollo astronauts made this journey in 3 days. Think about what that means. They were traveling at speeds of nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour. At that velocity, a baseball would cross the entire United States in about 6 minutes. The astronauts were hurtling through the void faster than any human beings had ever traveled, and there was nothing around them but darkness and stars and the thin metal walls of their spacecraft. But distance is just the beginning of the problem, because space is not simply empty. Space is hostile, actively, aggressively hostile to human life. On Earth, we live at the bottom of an ocean of air. We don't think about it, but every moment of every day, we're protected by this invisible shield. The atmosphere blocks harmful radiation from the sun. It maintains pressure that keeps our blood from boiling. It provides the oxygen we breathe and the moderate temperatures we require. We evolved for 4 billion years within this protective embrace, and we are utterly dependent upon it. The moment you leave Earth's atmosphere, you leave everything that makes human life possible. In space, there is no air. If an astronaut's suit develops a leak, they have perhaps 90 seconds before they lose consciousness. Not from suffocation, though that would come eventually, but from something far more immediate. In the vacuum of space, the pressure drops to nearly zero. The fluids in your body, the water in your tissues, would begin to boil at body temperature. Your lungs would rupture if you tried to hold your breath. You would experience something called ebullition, a condition so rare on Earth that most doctors have never seen it. All of this would happen in less than 2 minutes. This is the environment through which we sent human beings for 8 days in spacecraft held together by rivets and engineering ingenuity. Now let me tell you about radiation, because this is where the challenge becomes truly daunting. We are bathed in radiation every moment of our lives. Cosmic rays from distant supernovae, particles streaming from the sun, radiation from the rocks beneath our feet. But on Earth, we're protected. Our planet's magnetic field extends far into space, deflecting the most dangerous charged particles. Our atmosphere absorbs most of what remains. By the time radiation reaches the surface, it's been reduced to levels our bodies can handle. In space, there is no such protection. The Apollo astronauts had to pass through something called the Van Allen radiation belts. These are zones of intense radiation surrounding Earth, where charged particles from the sun are trapped by our planet's magnetic field. The belts extend from about 1,000 kilometers above the surface to beyond 60,000 kilometers. And to reach the moon, you have to fly directly through them. For years, some have pointed to the Van Allen belts as proof that the moon landings were impossible. How could astronauts survive passage through such intense radiation? The answer reveals something important about both physics and engineering. The Van Allen belts are dangerous, but they're not uniformly dangerous. Like any natural phenomenon, they have structure. There are regions of higher intensity and regions of lower intensity. The Apollo trajectory was specifically calculated to pass through the thinner sections of the belts, minimizing exposure time. The astronauts spent roughly 30 minutes in the most intense regions, but even 30 minutes of elevated radiation is significant. The Apollo astronauts received radiation doses roughly equivalent to a few chest X-rays. Not pleasant, but not immediately harmful. The long-term effects, the increased cancer risk, the possible genetic damage, these were risks that the astronauts accepted. They knew they were venturing into an environment that might kill them slowly. Years after their triumphant return, they went anyway. But the Van Allen belts were not the only radiation hazard. Once beyond Earth's magnetic field, the astronauts were exposed to galactic cosmic rays. These are not gentle. These are high-energy particles, some traveling at nearly the speed of light, originating from events so violent they defy imagination. Supernovae, colliding neutron stars, the jets of black holes. These particles pass through the walls of spacecraft as if they weren't there. They pass through the human body, leaving trails of damaged cells in their wake. A single heavy cosmic ray can destroy thousands of cells along its path. And in deep space, astronauts are struck by these particles constantly. The Apollo command module had aluminum walls roughly 2 millimeters thick. This provided essentially no protection against galactic cosmic rays. The astronauts were, in effect, unshielded. How did they survive? The answer is time. The astronauts were only in deep space for a few days. The cumulative radiation dose, while significant, was not immediately lethal. But here's what's remarkable. NASA didn't know for certain that the radiation levels would be survivable. They had theoretical models. They had measurements from unmanned probes. But no human had ever ventured beyond the Van Allen belts. No one knew with certainty what awaited them. They went anyway. Now let me tell you about the spacecraft itself. Because when you examine the actual hardware that carried men to the moon, the improbability of the achievement becomes almost overwhelming. The Apollo command module, the capsule that the astronauts lived in for most of the journey, had an interior volume of roughly 6 cubic meters. That's approximately the size of a large automobile interior. 3 men lived in this space for 8 days. They ate there. They slept there. They performed their bodily functions there. And they conducted one of the most complex navigational feats in human history there. The walls of the command module were made of aluminum honeycomb, a material chosen primarily for its light weight. The outer skin was just a few millimeters thick. Between the astronauts and the vacuum of space, between them and temperatures that ranged from 120 degrees Celsius in direct sunlight to minus 150 degrees in shadow, there was nothing but this thin shell of metal. The heat shield that protected the astronauts during re-entry was made of a material called avcoat. It was applied by hand, pressed into honeycomb cells by technicians working with tools that looked more like kitchen implements than aerospace equipment. This hand-applied ablative material was all that stood between the astronauts and the 2,800-degree temperatures of atmospheric re-entry. If you had told an engineer in 1960 that within 9 years we would send men to the moon in a spacecraft assembled largely by hand, they would have thought you were insane. The entire enterprise seemed to violate basic principles of what was possible. And yet, the lunar module, the spidery craft that actually landed on the moon, was even more remarkable. And by remarkable, I mean terrifying. The walls were so thin that an astronaut could have pushed a screwdriver through them. In some places, the aluminum skin was just 0.012 inches thick. That's thinner than 3 sheets of aluminum foil. Engineers called it a tissue paper spacecraft. And they weren't entirely joking. The lunar module was designed to operate only in the vacuum of space, where there was no atmospheric pressure to resist. It didn't need to be strong. It only needed to be light. Every gram mattered. Every unnecessary component was eliminated. The astronauts' seats were removed after designers realized they could simply stand during the brief landing and ascent phases. The windows were made as small as possible. The result was a spacecraft that looked like it had been assembled in someone's garage, mylar sheets and exposed wiring, bare metal and hand-printed labels. If you saw the lunar module today, you would think it was a prototype, a mock-up, surely not the actual machine that carried human beings to the surface of another world. But it was. And it worked every single time. This brings me to perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the Apollo program, the computers. In 1969, the most sophisticated computer most people had ever encountered was a desktop calculator. The idea of a computer small enough to fit on a spacecraft, powerful enough to navigate to the moon, and reliable enough to bet human lives on was almost inconceivable. The Apollo guidance computer had approximately 74 kilobytes of fixed memory and just 4 kilobytes of erasable memory. That's the total 78 kilobytes to navigate to another world. To put this in perspective, the photograph you take with your smartphone uses more memory than the entire Apollo guidance computer possessed. The phone in your pocket has roughly 1,000,000 times more computing power than the machine that navigated to the moon. And yet this primitive computer, with its hand-woven magnetic core memory, performed calculations that would have taken teams of human mathematicians weeks to complete. It processed radar data, calculated trajectories, controlled the spacecraft attitude, and displayed information to the astronauts, all simultaneously, all in real time, all while using less electrical power than a modern laptop. The software was written by teams of programmers at MIT, led by a remarkable woman named Margaret Hamilton. The code was so efficient, so carefully crafted, that it fit entirely within the computer's tiny memory. There was no room for error. There was no room for debugging. Every line of code had to work perfectly the first time because there would be no second chances. During the Apollo 11 landing, the computer began flashing a series of alarms. Program alarm 1202. Program alarm 1201. The computer was being overloaded with data. It was running out of processing capacity. This was the moment that should have ended the mission. This was when, by all logic, Houston should have ordered an abort. The computer was failing, the primary navigation system was overwhelmed, and the lunar module was descending toward the surface of the moon at increasing speed. But Margaret Hamilton had anticipated this possibility. Years earlier, she had insisted on including a priority scheduling system in the software. When the computer became overloaded, it automatically shed lower priority tasks and focused only on what was essential. Keeping the astronauts alive and landing them safely, the computer didn't fail. It adapted. And 12 seconds after the first alarm, Neil Armstrong took manual control and landed the Eagle with roughly 20 seconds of fuel remaining. 20 seconds. If the descent had taken just 20 seconds longer, if there had been one more unexpected obstacle, if anything at all had gone slightly differently, the lunar module would have run out of fuel while still above the surface. Armstrong and Aldrin would have crashed into the moon, the first human beings to die on another world. 20 seconds was the margin between triumph and tragedy. 20 seconds separated the greatest achievement in human history from its greatest disaster. Think about that for a moment. We went to the moon on a margin of 20 seconds. Now let me tell you about the rocket, because the Saturn V remains one of the most audacious machines ever constructed by human beings. To escape Earth's gravity, you need to reach a speed of approximately 11 kilometers per second. That's 25,000 miles per hour. And to achieve that speed while carrying 3 astronauts, their spacecraft, the lunar module, and all the supplies necessary for an 8-day journey, you need an enormous amount of energy. The Saturn V rocket stood 363 feet tall. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty. It weighed 6.5 million pounds when fully fueled. And when those 5 F1 engines ignited, they produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The sound alone was enough to kill small animals miles away. Windows shattered in buildings across the Cape. The ground shook as if an earthquake had struck. Each F1 engine burned 3 tons of fuel per second. 3 tons every second. The 5 engines together consumed 15 tons of propellant every second of powered flight. The first stage exhausted its fuel in just 2.5 minutes, by which point the rocket was already 40 miles high and traveling at 6,000 miles per hour. And here's what's truly remarkable. These engines were developed with 1,960 seconds technology. No computer simulations, no advanced materials science. Engineers designed them with slide rules and tested them by building prototypes and seeing what happened when they fired. Many of those early tests ended in explosions. Engines tore themselves apart. Combustion chambers melted. Turbo pumps disintegrated. The F1 engine suffered from a problem called combustion instability. The fuel and oxidizer, liquid oxygen and refined kerosene, would mix and burn unevenly inside the combustion chamber. This created pressure waves that bounced around inside the engine, amplifying with each reflection until the entire assembly shook itself to pieces. It was like an opera singer shattering a wine glass, except the wine glass weighed several tons and was filled with explosive propellant. Engineers spent years solving this problem. They tried different injector designs. They experimented with baffles and acoustic dampeners. They set off small bombs inside running engines to study how the combustion responded to disturbances. Yes, they deliberately exploded bombs inside rocket engines to see what would happen. Eventually, through trial and error, through thousands of tests, through the accumulated wisdom of engineers who often didn't fully understand why their solutions worked, they created an engine that was stable, reliable, powerful beyond anything that had come before. The Saturn V flew 13 times. It never failed, not once. Every single launch was successful. Every single payload reached its intended destination. In an era before computer-aided design, before advanced metallurgy, before most of the tools we now consider essential to aerospace engineering, they built the most powerful machine in human history, and it worked perfectly every time. How is that possible? The answer, I believe, lies not in technology but in people. 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program at its peak. Engineers, technicians, seamstresses who sewed spacesuits, welders who joined rocket stages, programmers who wrote code by hand, secretaries who typed reports, janitors who kept the facilities clean. Each of them knew that their work might mean the difference between life and death for 3 human beings. There's a famous story about President Kennedy visiting NASA in 1962. He encountered a janitor mopping the floor and asked what he did. The janitor replied, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." That wasn't false modesty or wishful thinking. It was the simple truth. Every person in that program, from Wernher von Braun to the newest technician, understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. That understanding created a culture of excellence that has rarely been matched in human history. But culture alone doesn't explain everything. Let me tell you about the navigation problem, because this is where the achievement becomes almost mystical. To travel from Earth to the moon, you cannot simply point your rocket at the moon and fire. The moon is moving. The Earth is moving. Your spacecraft is moving. Everything is moving all the time in complex gravitational relationships that change constantly. The Apollo astronauts had to hit a target 238,000 miles away that was traveling through space at 2,300 miles per hour, while they themselves were traveling at 25,000 miles per hour. And they had to hit it with such precision that they could enter lunar orbit, descend to the surface, take off again, rendezvous with the command module, and return to Earth to splash down within a few miles of the recovery ships. This is the three-body problem. It's one of the most complex challenges in celestial mechanics. There is no simple equation that tells you where three gravitationally interacting objects will be at any given time. You have to calculate it step by step, moment by moment, constantly adjusting for perturbations and uncertainties. And they did this in 1969 with 78 kilobytes of computer memory, with backup calculations performed by hand using slide rules and mathematical tables. The navigation wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. Apollo 11 splashed down within 15 miles of the recovery ship. Apollo 12 landed within 600 feet of the Surveyor 3 probe that had touched down 2 years earlier. 600 feet on a world 238,000 miles away, using 1,960 seconds technology. How did they achieve such precision? Part of the answer lies in a device that would have been familiar to sailors centuries ago, a sextant. The Apollo spacecraft carried an optical navigation system that allowed astronauts to sight on stars and calculate their position. This ancient technique, refined and adapted for the space age, provided a backup to the computer navigation and allowed for constant verification of the spacecraft's trajectory. But the real answer is simpler and more profound. They achieved such precision because failure was not an option. Not in the cliched sense, but in the literal sense. There was no margin for error. A navigation mistake of even a fraction of a degree could mean missing the moon entirely, or entering the wrong orbit, or crashing into the lunar surface. So they checked everything. They verified every calculation. They built redundancy into every system. And they trained until the procedures became automatic, until the astronauts could perform complex maneuvers in their sleep. Let me tell you about the training, because this is another aspect that people rarely consider. The Apollo astronauts spent years preparing for missions that lasted only days. They practiced in simulators that reproduced every aspect of spaceflight with obsessive fidelity. They trained for every conceivable failure mode. They rehearsed emergency procedures until they could execute them blindfolded. Neil Armstrong once flew a lunar landing training vehicle that malfunctioned at 200 feet altitude. The vehicle began tumbling out of control. Armstrong had perhaps 2 seconds to react before impact. He ejected, his parachute barely opening in time, and landed safely while the vehicle crashed and exploded just yards away. The next day, he was back at work, preparing for the next training session. This was the caliber of human being we sent to the moon. Not reckless daredevils, but methodical professionals who had trained so thoroughly that even catastrophic failures became manageable problems. They had rehearsed disaster so many times that when real emergencies occurred, their responses were automatic. Apollo 13 demonstrated this most dramatically, when an oxygen tank exploded halfway to the moon, crippling the spacecraft The crew and ground controllers faced a situation no one had specifically anticipated, but they had trained for components of that situation. They knew their spacecraft intimately, and they improvised solutions using the skills and knowledge that years of preparation had provided. They used the lunar module as a lifeboat. They calculated new trajectories by hand when the computer resources became limited. They built an adapter to connect incompatible air scrubbers using plastic bags, cardboard, and tape. They survived temperatures near freezing, limited water, and the constant knowledge that they were further from home than any human beings had ever been in a crippled spacecraft that was slowly dying around them. And they made it home, alive. When I think about Apollo 13, I don't think about failure. I think about the extraordinary competence that turned potential tragedy into survival. The mission didn't achieve its objective, but in another sense, it achieved something greater. It proved that even when everything goes wrong, human ingenuity and preparation can find a way. Now, let me address something that has troubled many people over the years. The photographs. The Apollo astronauts took thousands of photographs on the lunar surface. Beautiful, crisp, perfectly exposed images that have become icons of human achievement. And for decades, skeptics have pointed to these photographs as evidence that something is wrong. The shadows don't align, they say. The stars are missing from the sky. The lighting looks artificial. Surely these images were staged in some secret studio, manufactured evidence of a journey that never occurred. I understand why people find these arguments compelling. The photographs do look unusual. They look almost too perfect. And when you've never been to an airless world with no atmosphere, your intuitions about how light should behave can lead you astray. Let me explain what's actually happening in those images, because the physics is fascinating. On Earth, we see shadows that are soft at the edges and filled with ambient light. This is because our atmosphere scatters sunlight in all directions. Even when you're standing in shadow, you're being illuminated by light that is bounced off air molecules, clouds, buildings, the ground, everything around you. Shadows on Earth are rarely pure black because light reaches them from multiple directions. On the moon, there is no atmosphere. None. The sky is not blue but black, even during the lunar day, because there are no air molecules to scatter the sunlight. When you stand in shadow on the moon, the only light reaching you comes from reflections off the lunar surface and off your surroundings. The shadows are darker, the contrast is higher. The lighting looks harsh and strange to eyes accustomed to Earth's diffused illumination. The shadows in the Apollo photographs appear to point in different directions because the lunar surface is not flat. It has hills, craters, ridges, and depressions. When sunlight hits uneven terrain, shadows follow the contours of the ground. Two objects standing near each other can cast shadows that seem to diverge if one is on a slight slope and the other is on level ground. This is not evidence of multiple light sources. It's evidence of topography. And the missing stars? This one is so simple that I'm amazed it still confuses people. The lunar surface in daylight is extremely bright. The astronauts were photographing sunlit landscapes, white space suits, and reflective equipment. Their cameras were set for daylight exposure with fast shutter speeds and small apertures to properly capture these bright subjects. At those settings, stars are far too dim to register on film. They're not missing, they're just too faint to see in a photograph optimized for bright sunlight. You can verify this yourself. Go outside on a clear night and photograph a brightly lit building with your phone or camera. The stars will be invisible in your image, even though you can see them perfectly well with your naked eye. The camera's exposure settings are wrong for capturing faint points of light when bright objects dominate the frame. Every supposed anomaly in the Apollo photographs has a simple explanation rooted in physics. The flag appears to wave because it has a horizontal rod along the top to keep it extended, and the astronauts had just finished handling it. In the vacuum of the moon, without air resistance, the motion persisted longer than it would on Earth. The flag wasn't waving in a breeze. It was oscillating from the force of being planted. The footprints look too crisp because lunar soil behaves differently than terrestrial sand. Without moisture or atmosphere, the fine lunar regolith holds its shape perfectly once compressed. Those footprints will remain on the moon for millions of years, undisturbed by wind or rain, silent testimony to human presence. The reflections in helmet visors show the lunar surface and equipment, but not the camera or photographer. This is because the astronaut taking the photograph was standing in front of the subject, not reflected in the visor's field of view. The geometry is consistent, the physics works out, there is no mystery here, only misunderstanding. But I think the best evidence for the moon landings comes not from analyzing photographs, but from something far more tangible. Let me tell you about the retroreflectors. During Apollo 11, 14, and 15, astronauts placed special mirrors on the lunar surface. These aren't ordinary mirrors. They're arrays of corner cube reflectors, prisms that reflect light directly back to its source regardless of the angle at which it arrives. They're still there. They're still working. And scientists use them every day. Observatories around the world fire powerful lasers at the moon and measure the time it takes for the light to return. By timing these reflections with extreme precision, we can measure the distance to the moon within a few centimeters. We've learned that the moon is slowly drifting away from Earth at about 3.8 centimeters per year. We've tested Einstein's theory of general relativity using these measurements. We've contributed to our understanding of the lunar interior by tracking subtle variations in the moon's orbit. How did those reflectors get there? Someone had to place them. And the only missions that visited those precise locations were Apollo 11, 14, and 15. If you believe the moon landings were faked, you must explain how those retroreflectors arrived on the lunar surface. Now, some will point out that the Soviet Union also placed retroreflectors on the moon using robotic Lunokhod rovers. This is true, but the Soviet reflectors are in completely different locations, and they are smaller, returning weaker signals. The Apollo reflectors remain the primary tools for lunar laser ranging precisely because they were placed by human hands in optimal positions with careful alignment. Robots can deliver packages to the moon, but the precision placement of the Apollo arrays required human presence, human judgment, human eyes assessing the terrain, and human hands adjusting the angle. But there's more physical evidence. The Apollo missions brought back 842 pounds of lunar rocks and soil samples. These samples have been studied by thousands of scientists in hundreds of laboratories across dozens of countries for over 50 years. They have been examined by researchers in the Soviet Union, in China, in nations that would have had every reason to expose an American fraud if one existed. The lunar samples are definitively not from Earth. They contain isotopic ratios that don't exist in terrestrial rocks. They have micrometeorite impact craters on individual grains formed by billions of years of bombardment in the vacuum of space. They contain no water, no organic compounds, no evidence of weathering or biological activity. They are exactly what we would expect from a world with no atmosphere, no water, and no life. You cannot fake these samples. The technology to artificially create lunar regolith with all its distinctive properties did not exist in 1969. It barely exists now. The samples are genuine. They came from the moon. And the only way to get 842 pounds of lunar material is to go there and bring it back. The Soviet Union tracked the Apollo missions with their own radio telescopes. They monitored every transmission, every telemetry signal, every moment of the journey. They had sophisticated equipment capable of determining the origin of radio signals. If those signals had come from Earth orbit or from a soundstage in Nevada, Soviet engineers would have known immediately. Think about the political context. In 1969, the United States and Soviet Union were locked in an existential struggle. The space race was a critical front in the Cold War. Soviet prestige was on the line. If there had been any possibility that America had faked the moon landings, the Soviet Union would have exposed the deception immediately and publicly. It would have been the greatest propaganda victory in history. Instead, the Soviets congratulated the Americans. They acknowledged the achievement. They knew it was real because they had tracked every moment of the mission with their own independent equipment. This is perhaps the most compelling evidence of all. The moon landings were verified by America's greatest adversary, a nation with both the capability to detect fraud and the motivation to expose it. Soviet silence is Soviet confirmation. Now let me tell you about something that has always moved me deeply. The human experience of standing on another world. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, he became the first human being to set foot on a celestial body other than Earth. Think about what that means. For all of human history, for the entire existence of our species, we had looked up at the moon and wondered. We told stories about it. We worshipped it as a god. We used it to mark time, to navigate, to inspire poetry and dreams. And then, on the 20th of July, 1969, a human being stood there. Armstrong's first words are famous. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But what strikes me most is what he said later, what he reported about the experience itself. He described the lunar surface as magnificent desolation. Those two words capture something essential about the moon. It is beautiful in its austerity. The stark contrast of light and shadow, the ancient craters, the distant Earth hanging in the black sky. But it is also empty, silent, utterly devoid of life. Buzz Aldrin performed a small private communion service on the lunar surface using a tiny chalice and wafer he had brought from his church. In the midst of the greatest technological achievement in human history, he paused to acknowledge something beyond technology, something spiritual, something that connected him to all the human beings who had ever looked up at that pale light in the sky and wondered. The astronauts reported that the lunar soil smelled like gunpowder or spent fireworks. This was the scent of ancient dust, undisturbed for billions of years, suddenly exposed to the oxygen in the lunar module. They were smelling time itself, the accumulated history of a world that had been dead since before life existed on Earth. They left behind more than footprints and equipment. Each mission left a plaque. Apollo 11's read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Those words are still there on a small metal plate attached to the descent stage of the Eagle. They will remain legible for millions of years, perhaps longer, a message from our species to any future visitors. We also left behind something stranger. On Apollo 11, the astronauts deposited a small silicon disk containing goodwill messages from 73 nations. The messages were miniaturized to microscopic size, requiring a microscope to read. Leaders from around the world contributed statements of hope, of peace, of wonder at human achievement. That disk remains on the moon, a time capsule from a moment when our species briefly united in a common purpose. And we left behind the American flag, or rather, we left behind 6 American flags, one for each landing mission. These flags have now been exposed to decades of unfiltered solar radiation. The ultraviolet light has bleached the fabric. Scientists believe the flags are now completely white, their colors erased by the relentless bombardment of solar energy. I find something poignant in this. The symbols of national pride that we planted on the moon have been transformed into blank white banners. Surrender flags, perhaps. Or maybe something else. Maybe they've become symbols not of any single nation, but of humanity itself. White flags representing peace, planted on a world that has known nothing but peace for its entire existence. Because the moon doesn't care about nations. It doesn't care about politics or borders or the Cold War. It simply exists as it has existed for 4 billion years, waiting for whoever might visit. The footprints of American astronauts share the lunar surface with Soviet robotic probes, with Chinese rovers, with Japanese and Indian and European orbiters. The moon belongs to no one and everyone. Let me tell you about the men who made this journey, because understanding them helps us understand how the impossible became possible. The Apollo astronauts were not ordinary people. They couldn't be. The selection process was brutal, designed to identify individuals who combined exceptional physical fitness, technical brilliance, psychological stability, and something harder to define. Call it the right stuff. Call it courage. Call it the ability to remain calm while sitting on top of millions of pounds of explosive propellant, waiting for someone to light the fuse. Most of them were test pilots. They had spent their careers flying experimental aircraft at the edge of what was technically possible. They had experienced equipment failures, engine fires, control malfunctions. They had ejected from disintegrating aircraft and walked away. They had buried friends who weren't so lucky. Death was not an abstraction to these men. It was a colleague, always present, always watching, waiting for a moment of inattention. Neil Armstrong nearly died at least 3 times before Apollo 11. Once when his X-15 rocket plane bounced off the atmosphere during re-entry, skipping like a stone across the upper air, carrying him 40 miles past his intended landing site. Once when his Gemini 8 capsule began spinning wildly after a thruster malfunction, rotating so fast that he and David Scott nearly lost consciousness before Armstrong managed to regain control. And once in that lunar landing training vehicle, when he ejected just seconds before it crashed and exploded. Any one of these incidents would have ended most careers. Armstrong returned to work the next day. This wasn't bravado, it was professionalism. He had a job to do, and personal fear was simply not relevant to getting it done. Buzz Aldrin was different. A brilliant engineer with a doctorate from MIT, he had written his thesis on orbital rendezvous techniques. The procedures used to dock spacecraft in orbit bore his intellectual fingerprints. He was methodical, precise, sometimes difficult to work with because he demanded the same precision from others that he demanded from himself. On the lunar surface, while Armstrong photographed their surroundings, Aldrin conducted systematic soil mechanics experiments, testing how the lunar regolith behaved under various conditions. Even in that moment of supreme triumph, he was collecting data. Michael Collins orbited above, alone in the command module, while his colleagues walked on the moon. For 48 minutes of each orbit, he passed behind the moon and lost all contact with Earth. No radio signals could reach him. No human voice could penetrate the 2,000 miles of rock between him and home. He was, during those intervals, the most isolated human being who had ever lived. Farther from any other person than anyone in the entire history of our species. Collins later said that he didn't feel lonely, he felt awareness. Awareness of the immensity of the universe, of the smallness of human concerns, of the privilege of witnessing something that perhaps no one would ever witness again. He could cover the entire earth with his thumb. Everything he had ever known, everyone he had ever loved, all of human history and achievement and suffering hidden behind his thumbnail. These 3 men exemplified different aspects of what was required to reach the moon. Armstrong's preternatural calm under pressure, Aldrin's rigorous intellect, Collins's philosophical acceptance of solitude. Together, they formed a team capable of handling whatever the universe might throw at them. But they were also human. They made mistakes. They got frustrated. They disagreed with each other and with mission control. The mythology that has grown up around them sometimes obscures the simple fact that they were men, not gods. Exceptional men, certainly. But men nonetheless, with all the limitations and contradictions that implies. After returning from the moon, many of the astronauts struggled. The experience had changed them in ways they couldn't fully articulate. How do you go back to ordinary life after walking on another world? How do you find meaning in everyday tasks after you've looked back at Earth from 250,000 miles away and seen it as a fragile blue marble in an infinite darkness? Buzz Aldrin battled depression and alcoholism for years after Apollo 11. He later spoke openly about his struggles, helping to reduce the stigma around mental health issues. His honesty took a different kind of courage than flying to the moon, but it was courage nonetheless. Others found solace in religion, in science, in public service, in private contemplation. Each dealt with the weight of their experience in his own way. Some flourished, some faltered. All were marked forever by what they had seen and done. I think about the 12 human beings who have walked on the moon. 12? Out of all the billions who have ever lived, as I speak to you now, only 4 remain alive. Buzz Aldrin, David Scott, Charles Duke, and Harrison Schmitt. The youngest of them is in his late 80s. Soon, perhaps within the next decade, there will be no living human who has stood on another world. The last witnesses to that extraordinary moment will be gone, and we will have only their words, their photographs, their footprints preserved in lunar dust. This is why I believe we must return, not merely to plant flags or collect rocks, but to ensure that the experience of standing on another world does not fade from human memory. We need new witnesses. We need new stories. We need to remind ourselves that the impossible is not impossible, that the moon is not unreachably distant, that what we did once we can do again. But let me return to the engineering challenges, because there are aspects we haven't fully explored. Consider the problem of life support. A human being requires approximately 840 grams of oxygen per day to survive. They exhale carbon dioxide, which must be removed from the air or it will accumulate to toxic levels. They produce metabolic heat, which must be dissipated or they will overheat. They require water for drinking and food for energy. They produce waste products that must be managed. All of these biological necessities had to be addressed within a sealed spacecraft traveling through a vacuum. The Apollo Environmental Control System was a marvel of engineering. It provided oxygen from cryogenic storage tanks, maintained cabin pressure at about 5 pounds per square inch, removed carbon dioxide using lithium hydroxide canisters, controlled humidity and temperature, and managed the countless other details that kept human beings alive in an environment that was trying to kill them every second. The lithium hydroxide canisters were particularly critical. Carbon dioxide is insidious. You cannot smell it, you cannot see it. But as it accumulates, it causes headaches, confusion, loss of consciousness, and eventually death. The astronaut's breath contained carbon dioxide that had to be continuously scrubbed from the cabin air. Each canister could absorb a limited amount before becoming saturated and useless. The canisters had to be changed regularly, and there had to be enough canisters on board to last the entire mission. During Apollo 13, when the oxygen tank explosion crippled the command module, the crew retreated to the lunar module as a lifeboat. But the lunar module's lithium hydroxide canisters were square, while the command modules were round. They weren't interchangeable. Carbon dioxide began to build up. The astronauts were slowly suffocating. Engineers on the ground had to devise a way to adapt the square canisters to the round receptacles using only materials available on the spacecraft. They built a prototype using plastic bags, cardboard from flight plan covers, tape, and a sock. Then they talked the astronauts through the construction process, step by step, while carbon dioxide levels continued to rise. The improvised adapter worked. The astronauts survived. This is what I mean when I talk about the human element. No amount of engineering can anticipate every possible failure. At some point, you must rely on human creativity, human adaptability, human refusal to accept death as inevitable. The Apollo 13 crew and the engineers who supported them demonstrated that when everything goes wrong, brilliant people working together can find solutions that no one had imagined. Consider the spacesuits. Each Apollo suit was a self-contained spacecraft in miniature. It had to maintain pressure, provide oxygen, remove carbon dioxide, regulate temperature, protect against micrometeorites, allow mobility, and permit the astronaut to see and communicate. All of this in a garment that weighed about 180 pounds on Earth, but only 30 pounds in the moon's reduced gravity. The suits were handmade. Seamstresses at the International Latex Corporation, the same company that made Playtex bras and girdles, stitched the pressure garments with extraordinary precision. A single misplaced stitch could mean a leak could mean death. These women, whose names are largely forgotten by history, held astronauts' lives in their hands with every seam they sewed. The gloves were particularly challenging. An astronaut needed to manipulate tools, flip switches, collect samples, and operate cameras while wearing pressurized gloves on hands that would prefer to curl into fists. The pressure inside the suit wanted to inflate the gloves like balloons, resisting every movement. Engineers developed ingenious joint designs that allowed flexibility while maintaining pressure, but the gloves remained exhausting to use. Astronauts returned from moonwalks with hands cramped and blistered. The helmet visor had to protect against unfiltered solar radiation. On Earth, the atmosphere blocks most ultraviolet light and reduces the intensity of visible light. On the moon, the sun blazes with ferocious intensity against a black sky. Without protection, an astronaut would be blinded within seconds. The gold-coated visors that gave the Apollo helmets their distinctive appearance weren't decorative. They were essential survival equipment, filtering out radiation that would have destroyed human eyes. Every element of the suit represented thousands of hours of design, testing, and refinement. The suits were tested in vacuum chambers, in altitude chambers, in swimming pools, in aircraft flying parabolic arcs to simulate lunar gravity. Test subjects spent hours in prototype suits, identifying problems, suggesting improvements, pushing the designs towards something that might keep a human being alive in the most hostile environment ever encountered. And the suits worked. Across 6 lunar landing missions, 12 astronauts conducted dozens of hours of extravehicular activity on the lunar surface. Not a single suit failed catastrophically. Not a single astronaut was lost to a suit malfunction. The seamstresses and engineers had done their job with perfect precision. Now let me address the question of why we stopped going. Apollo 17 landed on the moon in December 1972. Since then, no human being has traveled beyond low Earth orbit. We have sent robots to Mars, to Jupiter, to the edge of the solar system. We have built space stations and launched telescopes, but we have not returned to the moon. Why? The simple answer is money. The Apollo program cost approximately $25 billion over its lifetime. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $150 billion today. In 1966, at the program's peak, NASA consumed more than 4% of the federal budget. By comparison, NASA's current budget is less than 0.5%. The political will that sustained Apollo evaporated once the primary goal was achieved. We had beaten the Soviets to the moon. The space race was won. The public, initially captivated by the drama of lunar exploration, grew accustomed to the extraordinary. By Apollo 17, television networks were reluctant to broadcast moonwalks because viewers found them boring. Human beings walking on another world had become insufficiently entertaining for American audiences. The Vietnam War consumed resources and attention. Domestic programs demanded funding. The dreams of the 1,960 seconds gave way to the realities of the 1,970 seconds. Apollo was not canceled because it failed, but because it succeeded. We had proven that we could reach the moon. Having proven it, we saw no reason to continue proving it. This represents, I believe, a profound failure of imagination. We treated the moon landings as a race to be won rather than a door to be opened. We sprinted to the moon, planted our flag, and came home. We did not build the infrastructure that would have allowed continued exploration. We did not establish a permanent presence. We did not take the next steps that would have opened the solar system to human expansion. And so we lost capabilities that we have not yet regained. The Saturn V production lines were shut down. The factories were closed. The engineers retired or moved to other projects. The institutional knowledge accumulated over a decade of intensive effort began to dissipate. Today, we could not build a Saturn V if we wanted to. The blueprints exist, but the expertise to translate those blueprints into functioning hardware has largely vanished. We must learn from this mistake. When we return to the moon, as I believe we will, we must return to stay. We must build permanent habitats, establish supply lines, create the foundations for sustained human presence. We must treat the moon not as a destination, but as a doorway, a stepping stone to Mars and beyond. Now let me tell you something that I have thought about for many years. Something that goes beyond the engineering, beyond the physics, beyond all the technical details we have discussed. It concerns the deeper meaning of what we accomplished when we went to the moon. When the Apollo 8 astronauts became the first human beings to orbit another world, they carried with them a camera. On Christmas Eve, 1968, as they emerged from behind the moon on their fourth orbit, William Anders looked out the window and saw something that no human eye had ever witnessed. The Earth rising above the lunar horizon. He grabbed the camera and took a photograph. That image, known simply as Earthrise, became one of the most influential photographs in human history. Not because of its technical quality, but because of what it revealed about ourselves. For the first time, we saw our world as it truly is. A small blue sphere wrapped in white clouds hanging in the infinite blackness of space. No borders visible from that distance, no divisions between nations or peoples, just one fragile world, the only home our species has ever known, isolated in a cosmic ocean that stretched beyond comprehension in all directions. That photograph changed how we think about ourselves. It helped launch the environmental movement. It reminded us that we all share the same small planet, that we breathe the same air, that we depend on the same thin layer of atmosphere and water and soil that makes life possible. The astronauts went to the moon and discovered Earth. Astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14, described what he called the overview effect. Looking back at Earth from the lunar surface, he experienced a profound shift in consciousness. The boundaries between nations seemed absurd from that vantage point. The conflicts that consumed so much human energy appeared trivial against the backdrop of cosmic immensity. He saw Earth as a living system, interconnected and fragile, and he understood in that moment that we are not separate from our world, but part of it. Many astronauts have described similar experiences. Michael Collins spoke of an overwhelming sense of the unity of life. Buzz Aldrin wrote about feeling connected to all of humanity. These men, trained as engineers and test pilots, not philosophers or poets, returned from the moon, speaking in terms that bordered on the mystical. Something about seeing Earth from space, about standing on another world and looking back at everything you have ever known, reduced to a point of light, changes a person in ways that are difficult to articulate. I believe this change in perspective may be the most important legacy of the Apollo program, more important than the scientific data, more important than the technological advances, more important even than the demonstration that humans can travel to other worlds. The true gift of Apollo was a new way of seeing ourselves. We are a young species. In the 14 billion year history of the universe, in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth, we have existed for only a few 100,000 years. Our civilization, such as it is, spans perhaps 10,000 years. Our science, our technology, our understanding of the cosmos, these are achievements of the last few centuries. In cosmic terms, we are infants just learning to walk, just beginning to ask questions about the universe we inhabit. And yet, in 1969, these infant beings managed to send 3 of their number to walk on another world. We reached across 250,000 miles of empty space and touched the face of the moon. We did this with technology that seems primitive by today's standards, with computers less powerful than the phones we carry in our pockets, with spacecraft held together by rivets and human determination. If we could do that then, what might we do now? What might we do in another 50 years, another 100, another 1,000? The moon was only the beginning. It was a first step, hesitant and uncertain, but a step nonetheless. The question is whether we will continue walking or whether we will sit down and forget that we ever learned to walk at all. I am sometimes asked whether the moon landings were worth the cost, whether the billions of dollars spent on Apollo might have been better used to address problems here on Earth. It is a fair question, and it deserves a serious answer. The direct benefits are easy to enumerate. Technologies developed for Apollo found their way into countless terrestrial applications. Memory foam, water purification systems, fire-resistant materials, cordless power tools, improved solar panels, medical imaging devices. The economic return on the Apollo investment has been estimated at many times the original cost. We did not simply spend money on going to the moon. We invested money in developing capabilities that continue to benefit us decades later. But I think the true value of Apollo cannot be measured in economic terms. Some things are valuable precisely because they transcend economics. We do not ask what the Sistine Chapel ceiling has contributed to the gross domestic product. We do not calculate the return on investment of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Some human achievements justify themselves by their very existence, by what they reveal about the heights our species can reach. The moon landings were such an achievement for one shining moment. We were not Americans or Soviets, capitalists or communists, nations divided by borders and ideologies. We were human beings reaching toward the stars. 600 million people watched Neil Armstrong take that first step. They watched from every continent, every nation, every walk of life, and for that moment, they were united in wonder. We need such moments. We need reminders that we are capable of greatness. We need proof that when we commit ourselves fully to a goal, when we bring our best minds and bravest hearts to a challenge, we can accomplish things that seemed impossible. In a world often defined by division and conflict, the moon landings stand as testament to what we can achieve together. Let me address one final question. Why should we return? The moon is not merely a destination. It is a laboratory, a resource depot, a stepping stone to the rest of the solar system. On the moon, we can test technologies that will be essential for missions to Mars and beyond. We can mine water ice from permanently shadowed craters, extracting hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel. We can establish astronomical observatories on the far side, shielded from Earth's radio noise. We can learn to live and work on another world, developing the skills and systems that will allow us to expand throughout the solar system. But more than that, we should return because it is in our nature to explore. We are the descendants of individuals who crossed oceans in wooden ships, who climbed mountains because they were there, who pushed into unknown territories with no guarantee of survival. That restless curiosity, that refusal to accept limits, that drive to know what lies beyond the horizon, these are defining characteristics of our species. If we abandon space, if we decide that the moon was enough, that we have no need to go further, we will be denying something essential about ourselves. We will be choosing to remain on one small world when the entire universe beckons. We will be accepting limits that exist only in our minds. The cosmos is vast beyond human comprehension. There are more stars in the observable universe than grains of sand on all the beaches of Earth. Around many of those stars orbit planets, some of which may harbor conditions suitable for life. We do not know whether we are alone in this immensity. We do not know what wonders await discovery on the worlds of our own solar system, let alone the worlds that circle distant suns. But we will never know if we do not go and look. The Apollo astronauts carried human consciousness to another world for the first time. They expanded the boundaries of human experience in a way that had not occurred since our ancestors first left Africa and spread across the globe. They proved that the universe is not closed to us, that we can reach beyond our home world, that the sky is not a ceiling but a doorway. When I look at the moon tonight, I will think about the footprints still preserved in the lunar dust. I will think about the retroreflectors still returning laser light to Earth. I will think about the plaques and flags and tiny silicon disc bearing messages of peace. I will think about 12 human beings who walked where no human had walked before, who looked up at the blue earth hanging in the black sky and understood something profound about our place in the cosmos. And I will think about all of you, the children who dream of becoming astronauts, the engineers who design spacecraft, the scientists who study the lunar samples, the teachers who explain orbital mechanics, the taxpayers who fund space programs, the citizens who vote for leaders who support exploration. All of you are part of this story. All of you carry the legacy of Apollo. The moon landing seemed impossible. By many measures, it should have been impossible. The distances, the radiation, the primitive technology, the 1,000 things that could have gone wrong, all of it argued against success. And yet we succeeded, not through luck, though luck played its part, not through magic, though the achievement sometimes feels magical. We succeeded through determination, through ingenuity, through courage, through the accumulated efforts of hundreds of thousands of human beings who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. That is the real lesson of Apollo. Not that we went to the moon, though that alone would be remarkable, but that we did something that everyone said could not be done. We reached beyond what was thought possible and grabbed hold of a new reality. We can do it again. We can return to the moon. We can go to Mars. We can send human beings to the moons of Jupiter and the rings of Saturn. We can become a truly spacefaring species at home in the cosmos rather than confined to a single world. All we have to do is decide that it matters. All we have to do is commit ourselves as we committed ourselves once before. All we have to do is remember that we are the species that walked on the moon, and we can walk there again. The universe is waiting for us. It has been waiting for 14 billion years. And finally, in our time, we have begun to answer its call. Let us not turn back now. Let us not abandon the dream that carried 12 human beings to the surface of another world. Let us instead embrace that dream, expand upon it, and carry it forward to destinations we can scarcely imagine, because that is who we are. That is what we do. We look up at the night sky, we wonder what lies beyond, and then, against all odds, we find a way to go there. We went to the moon. We actually went to the moon, and that changes everything.